Sometimes life puts us in unexpected situations that challenge our beliefs and force a change in perspective. Imagine yourself in a luxury restaurant where the atmosphere is one of exclusivity, refinement, and power. Everything is in place until something unexpected happens. A white millionaire, accustomed to feeling untouchable, decides to publicly humiliate a black family that dares to be in the same environment as him. He believes that his wealth and status give him the right to judge and look down on others. But what if, in the midst of his arrogance, he received a note that changed everything? A simple piece of paper that would make him question his entire life. What could be written in that note? Turn challenges into success. Glowing Star, don't miss the chance to be inspired and learn from stories of overcoming and innovation. Click subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Join our community that turns obstacles into steps to success. Sign up now and start changing your journey. Edward Stone, a millionaire with a cold heart and impeccable exterior, was a man who exuded superiority. He didn't need to say it, as his posture said it all. Upon entering the Silver Spoon restaurant, there was not a drop of humility in his steps. Wearing a tailored suit, he already knew that this environment was shaped to serve him. Without even looking directly at the doorman, Edward threw the car keys into the valet's hands, expecting to be treated like royalty. People like him rarely recognize those around them unless they are part of the same circle of power. It's a common trap that arrogance imposes, an illusion of invulnerability. Edward's arrogance was not limited to appearances. His behavior towards employees was a profound reflection of his sense of superiority. When the maitre d' led him to his table, Edward didn't even bother to hide his disdain. For him, life was a big stage, and he was the star. The way the waiters responded to his requests or orders, it would be more appropriate, only reinforced the vicious cycle of his perception that he was the center of the universe. And so, he continued, without ever questioning whether there was anything wrong with treating people like pieces on a board controlled by his hands. It's curious how arrogance is often the result of deep insecurities. Edward, as confident as he seemed, was perhaps a man fighting to maintain his status at all costs. Many people fall into this trap, believing that their worth depends on how others see them. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. No matter how much you try to control it, it always runs through your fingers. For those looking for a practical example, it's worth asking yourself, how dependent are we on other people's opinions to feel our importance? As he observed his surroundings, Edward felt a subtle, almost predatory satisfaction. That exclusive place was, for him, a refuge from everything he didn't want to face outside. Here, he was powerful. The soft classical music, the fine china, the impeccable service. Everything seemed to be tailor-made for people of his caliber. The presence of other customers, equally wealthy, only reinforced their sense of belonging. But this belonging was based on a fragile premise, which he still couldn't see. However, arrogance also blinds. Edward failed to realize that the deference he received from the staff was not out of genuine respect, but out of obligation. He believed his presence deserved automatic recognition, as if the world owed him something. It is interesting to note how wealth can sometimes create such a thick bubble around a person that they completely lose the ability to see beyond themselves. How would you feel knowing that people treat you well not because of who you are, but because of what you have? And so, the night continued, with Edward immersed in his bubble of arrogance. As he looked over the menu, he didn't even really need to read the options. I already knew what to order. The best, of course. For him, dinner was a mere formality, a ritual to reaffirm his position. He ordered the most expensive champagne, not because of its taste, but because of the impression it would make. Who has never encountered someone who values the price tag more than the pleasure of an authentic experience? At times, Edward could barely hide his disdain as he looked around at the employees. To him, they were just part of the scenery, invisible beings, existing only to serve him. This behavior is a classic reflection of the disconnect that arrogance can create. He couldn't see others as equals, but as extras in a story whose protagonist would always be him. And the saddest thing is that in this illusory theater of power, what is most lacking is authenticity in interactions. It is curious how, in his desire to maintain an image of power, Edward was unaware of the true meaning of respect. For him, respect was something bought, not earned. Maybe that's why he never questioned whether the people around him truly admired him, or just submitted to his status. In the long run, this type of thinking erodes any genuine bond that could be built. How do you build true respect? The answer may be quite different from what Edward believed. As the night progressed, Edward continued to be lost in his thoughts of grandeur. He felt like he was on top of the world, and this feeling prevented him from noticing the cracks in his perception of reality. Many of us fall into this trap. The belief that we are always right, that we are superior in some way, creates a barrier between us and others. And this barrier, one day, inevitably collapses. Edward didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn it the hard way possible. And it was like that, immersed in his own arrogance, that Edward didn't notice the subtle unfolding of a night that would change his life forever. Sometimes we are so blinded by what we think is important that we ignore the signs around us. How many opportunities have we missed because we weren't paying attention? The unfolding of that night was just beginning, and Edward had no idea what awaited him. The Harrison family's entry into the restaurant was like a gentle wave that disturbed Edward's calm and arrogant tide. The family, made up of Michael, Sarah, and little Jacob, entered the Silver Spoon with the same dignity as any other customer. But for Edward, it was an affront. He wondered silently how these people dared to mix in that environment that, for him, belonged exclusively to high-level people. This feeling of discomfort began to settle over Edward like a shadow, rooted in his prejudice, without him even realizing the poison he was creating. As the Harrison family was led to their table, Edward felt irritation rising within him. There was no clear reason, but the simple presence of that family bothered him. He murmured soft words, as if trying to rationalize his discomfort with the idea that they somehow didn't belong there. Prejudices often present themselves like this, without logic or reason, just an automatic response to something that deviates from what we consider normal in our particular world. Edward, without realizing it, was a victim of his own prejudices. And it's curious how, in situations like these, people tend to look for justifications for their discomfort. For Edward, it was as if the mere fact that the Harrison family was there diminished the value of the environment. He began to observe the details, the clothes they wore, the way they interacted, even the kind gestures between father, mother, and son. But instead of seeing the beauty in these interactions, he only saw signs that somehow they were out of place. How many times do we do this in everyday life? We look to others to justify our own prejudices. As Edward continued to observe them, he began to build stories in his head about who they were. Maybe they were ordinary people who had saved for months to have that experience, or maybe they were just there to pretend to be something they weren't. Of course, none of this was true, but Edward was so caught up in his limited view of the world that he couldn't see beyond it. He became a prisoner of his own mind, unable to see that the Harrison family, like any other, had a right to be there. It is common for prejudice to make us construct false narratives about others. Edward, in his arrogance, believed he knew the world and the people in it, but he was far from the truth. What he couldn't understand was that his vision was limited by the walls he had built himself. The Harrison family, with their simplicity and elegance, was not there to impress anyone. They were there to enjoy a family meal, something Edward couldn't understand. As the night progressed, Edward began to hear, even if against his will, the soft laugh of little Jacob and the affectionate whispers between Sarah and Michael. These simple sounds, which in any other context could bring lightness, only increased his frustration. For Edward, it was all a constant reminder that something was beyond his control. He didn't understand how these people could seem so at ease in an environment that, in his mind, wasn't meant for them. Prejudice, when not recognized, makes us blind to what really matters. And then, Edward's irritation began to manifest itself more palpably. He could no longer hide his disdain. With every laugh, with every exchange of words between the Harrisons, his face contorted in displeasure. He began to look around, as if seeking silent support from other customers, hoping they would share his outrage. But the truth is that the problem was only within himself. We often isolate ourselves in our own convictions, believing that the world around us also shares our prejudices. When observing the Harrison family, Edward did not see humanity. He only saw a threat to his sense of exclusivity. He was so focused on maintaining control of what he considered to be his space that he couldn't see beyond that. And this is something that many of us can recognize. How many times do we feel threatened by something that, deep down, doesn't harm us in any way, but that challenges the idea we have constructed of the world? Edward was a clear example of this internal conflict. However, what Edward didn't know was that, by closing himself off from the presence of the Harrison family, he was depriving himself of the opportunity to expand his own worldview. Arrogance and prejudice have this characteristic. They limit our capacity for growth. For someone like Edward, recognizing this would be the first step towards a transformation, but he wasn't ready yet. He continued to observe his family with contempt, becoming more and more irritated, without realizing that this irritation only revealed his own insecurities. What Edward didn't realize was that the discomfort he felt was not caused by the Harrison family, but by himself. His need for control, his desire to keep things as they were, made him feel threatened by anything that strayed from his concept of normality. The lesson he would later learn is something we can all apply. Often, what irritates us in others is a reflection of what we have difficulty accepting in ourselves. But that night, Edward was still far from understanding that. As dinner went on, Edward's irritation seemed to increase by the minute. Sitting comfortably in his leather chair, he could barely focus on his own meal, distracted by the soft laughter and discreet conversations of the Harrison family. For Edward, that dinner should be a moment of pure pleasure and exclusivity. However, the presence of that family disturbed him in a way that he could not understand, or rather, did not want to understand. His discomfort turned into palpable irritation, and every word that left his mouth was filled with a condescending tone. The waiters, in turn, did everything they could to keep the atmosphere pleasant, trying to prevent Edward from losing his temper completely. By now, he was already impatient, tapping his fingers on the table, eager to vent his frustrations. In his mind, the Harrisons were out of place, and the mere fact that they were here, enjoying a peaceful meal, seemed almost an affront to his notion of exclusivity. The curious thing is that the more Edward focused on the family's presence, the more he disconnected from the real purpose of his dinner, enjoying the moment. This escalation of irritation is common in situations of prejudice. When someone feels threatened by something that defies their expectations, every little detail becomes a source of frustration. Edward was not only bothered by the Harrison family's presence, but by what they represented. They were calm, happy, and most importantly, belonging to the same environment as him. This, for Edward, was unacceptable. He believed that there was an invisible line that separated people like him from others, and the presence of the Harrison family somehow violated that line. As dinner progressed, Edward's attitude began to draw the attention of other customers. Although his words were discreet, his expressions and the way he looked at the Harrison family spoke much more than he could realize. Edward's quick and judgmental glances did not go unnoticed, but at that moment, he was so immersed in his own indignation that he didn't realize the impact his actions were having on his surroundings. The discomfort was visible, but for Edward, it was the family who was at fault, not him. The innocent laugh of Jacob, the Harrison's son, seemed to be the trigger for Edward to lose his temper once and for all. Every time the boy laughed or pointed out something in the restaurant, Edward's blood boiled. It was as if the boy was mocking his own existence, which was, of course, completely irrational. This is the power of prejudice. It blinds us to reality and makes us see threats where none exist. For Edward, a child's laughter was something that undermined his perception of order and status, which reveals how fragile his sense of superiority really was. Soon, Edward's comments began to become more audible. He muttered insults and made sarcastic remarks about how certain people should behave in environments like that. His passive-aggressive behavior began to create a tension in the room that no one could ignore. The waiters, already accustomed to demanding customers, were doing their best to maintain their composure and professionalism. but even they were beginning to feel the weight of the situation. And so, a simple meal began to turn into a silent battlefield. What Edward didn't realize at that moment was that his own behaviors were disintegrating in the eyes of others. As he continued to hurl veiled jokes and insults, the eyes around him increasingly turned to him rather than the Harrison family. It's a lesson that many only learn too late. The more we try to humiliate others, the more we expose our own flaws. Edward was falling into the very trap he had created, not realizing that the Harrisons' dignity was intact, while his began to unravel. Eventually, Edward reached a point where his own presence in the restaurant became unbearable for him. The Harrison family continued to eat dinner peacefully, ignoring his provocations, which only served to intensify Edward's anger. Every time the family acted normally, Edward found himself increasingly excluded from his bubble of superiority. He couldn't accept that they could belong to the same space as him. For Edward, the family's presence was a direct attack on his identity and what he believed to be the natural order of things. As time passed, Edward's dinner became less and less enjoyable. He barely touched his food, and his attention was completely focused on the family next door. This shows how obsessing over what we consider wrong in others can keep us away from what really matters. Instead of enjoying his meal and his surroundings, Edward was consumed with irrational rage. And this anger had nothing to do with the Harrison family themselves, but with what they symbolized for him, a breakdown in his worldview. Thus, Edward was on the verge of a breakdown. He didn't know it, but he was about to explode once and for all, allowing his irritation to turn into something even more destructive. His desire to control his environment and maintain the exclusivity he believed was rightfully his was about to be challenged in ways he could never have imagined. And how this night unfolded would show Edward that sometimes true control lies not in dominating the space around us, but in understanding and questioning our own prejudices. The moment Edward finally lost control was when his irritation turned into something much more public and destructive. He was about to do something that couldn't be undone. As he looked at the Harrison family, the accumulated anger boiled over aggressively. Without any warning, Edward raised his voice, directing a sarcastic comment at the family. He wondered aloud how they could afford a place like that, implying that they somehow didn't belong there. This was the turning point of the evening. The calm, refined atmosphere of the restaurant was filled with palpable discomfort. Edward's words echoed in the restaurant, and all eyes turned to him. The customers, who until then had been trying to ignore Edward's passive-aggressive behavior, were now completely focused on what he would say next. A woman at the next table exchanged uncomfortable glances with her husband, while another couple lowered their heads, avoiding the awkward scene. The tension in the air was undeniable. The atmosphere, which was once one of sophistication, now seemed to be on the verge of collapse. And at the center of it all was Edward, feeding off his own arrogance. Edward's attack on the Harrison family was direct and cruel. He made a point of humiliating the family, treating them as if they were intruders in a space that, in his mind, was reserved only for the deserving. He didn't mince words, questioning how they could be there, and even suggesting, in a sarcastic tone, that perhaps they had won the lottery. Edward's words were like knives thrown into the air, cutting through the room with a disregard no one expected to witness in such a refined restaurant. The truth is that he had already crossed a line from which he could not return. As Edward continued to speak, the silence in the restaurant became unbearable. The other customers were visibly uncomfortable, many of them shocked by Edward's audacity and lack of politeness. Some whispered among themselves, while others exchanged disapproving glances. The restaurant staff, in turn, did not know how to act. The maitre d' and waiters, who had previously treated Edward with the deference he expected, were now tense and unsure of how to intervene. After all, he was a regular and influential customer, but he had clearly crossed the line. The curious thing is that, while Edward hoped that his outburst would put the Harrison family in their place, the effect was just the opposite. Michael and Sarah maintained their composure the entire time, avoiding any type of reaction that could further fuel Edward's anger. They did not reciprocate with harsh words, nor did they try to justify their presence there. Instead, they remained calm, focused on their son and the meal, as if the situation didn't directly affect them. This behavior, paradoxically, only served to irritate Edward even more. As Edward continued his tirade, he began to realize that he wasn't getting the support he expected from the other customers. Instead of knowing smiles or looks of approval, he was met with disapproval. It only made him feel more vulnerable, as if control of the situation was slipping through his fingers. Arrogance often leads us to believe we are right, even when everyone around us shows us otherwise. And that's exactly what happened to Edward at that moment. He was alone in his fury. By this time, Edward had completely lost control of his words. He was blinded by anger and the need to reassert his sense of superiority. His comments, which had previously been low murmurs, were now loud enough to be heard by everyone in the restaurant. He insulted the Harrison family in several ways, suggesting they were trying to show off in a place where they clearly didn't belong. And the more he spoke, the more he distanced himself from the dignity he so believed he possessed. The impact of Edward's words was profound. The restaurant, once a haven of luxury and calm, was now filled with tension and discomfort. People avoided looking directly at him, but it was impossible to ignore what was happening. It's interesting how, in situations like this, the behavior of a single person can affect the entire environment. Edward had turned dinner for everyone present into an experience marked by hostility and embarrassment. And all this because of their own prejudices. Even after his outburst, Edward didn't seem to realize how far he had gone. He continued to make sarcastic comments and laugh exaggeratedly, as if he was waiting for the others to join him in his attempt to ridicule the Harrison family. But the silence in the restaurant was deafening. Nobody supported him. On the contrary, many customers were now clearly uncomfortable, and some even began to question whether they should remain there. The lesson Edward had not yet learned was simple. Respect is not earned by power, but by the dignity with which we treat others. As the situation reached its climax, it became clear that Edward had caused irreparable damage to his reputation that night. The hateful behavior he displayed would not soon be forgotten, either by customers or restaurant staff. At that moment, he still believed he was right, but the truth was that he had destroyed himself in everyone's eyes. The words he had spoken, filled with hatred and prejudice, had revealed who he really was. What he didn't yet know was that the turnaround was about to happen. After his show of arrogance, Edward was satisfied, believing he had reaffirmed his place of superiority over others. However, this feeling was short-lived. When the waiter approached with a folded envelope in his hands, Edward assumed it was just the bill, something routine on his nights of extravagant dinners. He barely glanced at the waiter as he took the paper, dismissive as ever. But the contents of that note were anything but ordinary. As he unfolded it, the first words began to dismantle the reality that Edward had constructed throughout the night. What the note revealed was a disconcerting truth. The Harrison family, which Edward had ridiculed so much during dinner, actually owned the restaurant. Not only that, but they also owned other successful businesses and were recognized in the community for their philanthropy. The revelation hit Edward like a punch in the gut. The man who had spent the night insulting, belittling, and ridiculing a family now realized that they were people of a stature that went far beyond his own, not just financially, but morally. The moment Edward read those words, the ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet. His world, which had once seemed so solid and controlled, was now crumbling before his eyes. He reread the notes several times, as if he expected the words to change, that there was some mistake. But there was no mistake. These were the people he had treated with contempt all night, and now he knew that, in fact, they were the people he should have respected more than anyone else there. The feeling of shame began to set in slowly. The shame Edward felt was not immediate. Initially, it was a wave of disbelief. As someone who had always been confident in his power and status, he could not accept that he had been so completely wrong in his assumptions. In Edward's mind, wealth and success were outward signs, like the expensive suit he wore, the car he drove. How could a family he had judged so harshly be the owners of the restaurant he valued so much? Reality began to crumble as he understood the size of his mistake. As Edward reflected on what he had just discovered, the memory of his words at dinner began to weigh on him. He remembered every insult, every sarcastic comment he had directed at the Harrison family. It was as if he could hear his own voice echoing in the now uncomfortable silence of the restaurant. Every sentence, said with such arrogance, now seemed ridiculous. The sense of superiority he had felt throughout the night disappeared, replaced by a profound sense of insignificance. As shame began to take hold, Edward realized there was no way to undo what he had done. The words he spoke could not be taken back, and the damage he caused could not be erased. He had exposed himself in a way he never could have predicted. And now, everyone in the restaurant knew that the man he had tried to humiliate was, in fact, the true owner of this luxurious environment. Edward had never felt so vulnerable in his entire life, and that vulnerability consumed him. The note in Edward's hand seemed to burn. He wanted to get up and run away, avoid the eyes of others, escape the situation he himself had created. However, I knew this would only make things worse. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely powerless. There was no escaping what he had done, and now he was stuck in this situation. The irony of it all was that for so long Edward had believed that power came from controlling others. But in that moment, he realized that true power was in how we treat people, regardless of who they are. Edward then began to see the night with different eyes. Everything he had done, the way he looked down on the Harrison family, his arrogant laughs, his dismissive looks, now seemed like a huge mistake. He finally understood that what defines a person is not how much they can control others, but rather the respect and dignity with which we treat others, regardless of their appearances or our assumptions about them. This moment of epiphany hit him with a force he never expected. As Edward looked around, waiting for someone to say something, he realized that the silence in the restaurant was deafening. The people who had previously watched his arrogance in silence now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He, who had so despised the Harrison family, was now in the position of being despised. But the difference was that the Harrison family had never treated him the way he treated them. In that moment, Edward saw the true strength of that family, their ability to maintain dignity and grace, even in the face of behavior as heinous as his. So Edward began to sink into his chair, realizing that the true weight of the night wasn't just in his humiliation, but in the lesson he was about to learn. He still didn't know how he could redeem himself, but he knew he would have to face what he did. And, most importantly, he would have to do it with humility, something that, until that moment, he had never needed to exercise. After reading the note, Edward found himself trapped in a spiral of shame and regret. He knew that what he had done that night couldn't be undone, but he also knew that he couldn't just leave the restaurant without trying to make things right. With a heavy heart, he slowly rose from his chair. Each step toward the Harrison family table seemed more difficult than the last. The silence in the restaurant was now unbearable, and all eyes were on him. But for the first time in a long time, Edward didn't care what anyone else thought. He was just focused on doing the right thing. When he arrived at the Harrison family table, Edward hesitated for a moment. He didn't know exactly what to say. How could he apologize for something so horrible? However, as he looked at Michael, Sarah, and little Jacob, he realized that the words had to come from the heart. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," he began, his voice shaking, I have been incredibly disrespectful to you tonight. I made terrible assumptions and treated them in a way I should never have treated anyone. His voice trailed off for a moment, but he continued, determined to express his regret. Michael and Sarah's reaction was, to Edward's surprise, full of grace. They showed no anger or resentment. Instead, Michael, with a calm and collected tone, responded, "We understand that everyone makes mistakes. The most important thing is how you choose to act on them." These words struck Edward as a reminder that true strength lies not in power or wealth, but in compassion and understanding. At that moment, he realized how much he still had to learn about humility. For many, this would be the end of the journey, but for Edward, it was just the beginning. Edward's humility became evident when he directly apologized to Jacob, the couple's son. He bent down to the boy's height and said, "I'm sorry, Jacob. I was very cruel tonight, and it wasn't right. I hope one day you can forgive me." The boy, with his innocent and curious eyes, looked at Edward for a moment before smiling shyly. This simple gesture made Edward feel even smaller, but in a way that freed him from the weight of his arrogance. It was as if, by admitting his mistake, he began to free himself from the prison he had built himself over the years. Throughout his life, Edward always believed that his position in the world was defined by his wealth and status. But there, in that small exchange of words, he realized that these values were insignificant compared to the strength of forgiveness. Michael and Sarah didn't have to forgive him, but they chose to do so. They understood that holding on to a grudge only feeds a cycle of negativity. Through their behavior, they taught Edward a lesson he would never learn in any of the exclusive circles in which he was accustomed to living. However, Edward's path to redemption would not be easy. Admitting your mistakes was just the first step. From then on, he would need to work hard to become a better person, someone capable of seeing beyond appearances and treating everyone with the respect they deserve. That night at the Silver Spoon restaurant was a milestone in Edward's life, and he knew that if he wanted to truly redeem himself, he would have to continue learning and growing. Michael, upon noticing this determination in Edward's eyes, gave him some valuable advice. Real change happens when we choose to learn from our mistakes, not when we run away from them. Those words echoed in Edward's mind as he walked away from the Harrison family table. He knew there was still a long way to go, but he also knew he had taken the first step. What once seemed like an ordinary night had now turned into a turning point in his life. Edward was beginning to understand that his material wealth was an illusion of power, and that a person's true value lies in how they treat others, especially those who are different from them. That was the lesson he would carry with him forever. As Edward returned to his table, the restaurant slowly began to return to normal. People were still watching him, but now there was an air of understanding in the room. Many of the customers had witnessed Edward's transformation throughout that night. They saw an arrogant, powerful man deconstructed and then humbly reconstructed himself. And that in itself was a lesson for everyone there. Sometimes true greatness is not in never making mistakes, but in recognizing mistakes and doing something to correct them. Edward knew he couldn't go back in time and undo what he had done, but he could choose how to act from that moment on. He looked at the note in his hands once more, now not as a symbol of his humiliation, but as a reminder that in the end, everyone is equal, regardless of their material possessions. And with that thought, Edward felt a strange relief, as if he had finally found a part of himself that had been lost for so long. The journey to redemption would be long, but he was ready to face it. So, what are you going to do with this knowledge? What this story shows us is that we can all get caught up in our biases and mistakes, but true greatness lies in recognizing our flaws and seeking change. The question that remains is, are you willing to reflect on how you treat the people around you? Are your assumptions about others limiting your ability to grow? Edward's transformation only began when he decided to face his mistakes and change his attitude. And you? Have you ever thought that maybe it's time to change some things in your life too? Take this moment to apply what you learned here. Don't let pride and arrogance stop you from seeing the value in those around you. And if you want to continue learning about how to transform your life and truly grow, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next teachings.